Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for joining us. We also want to wish a very happy Hanuman Jayanti for those who are observing this very wonderful sacred holiday, honoring the divine exemplar of courage and strength and devotion, Sri Hanuman. So we invite everyone to, as we generally do, to take a comfortable seat or posture, taking a moment to make sure that our audio is muted out. We can keep our cameras on or off as we feel comfortable. If we haven't already done so, an invitation here to close the eyes, or perhaps if it feels more comfortable to us, to simply soften the gaze. It's amazing just by closing the eyes or softening the gaze, how just in that simple act, almost immediately, the mind is a little bit quieter just by doing that. We'll begin as we generally do after the ringing of the bell with taking 3 deep breaths in and out, holding the breath for a few beats at each turn, allowing ourselves to be more intentionally grounded and connected to our breath. You're welcome to follow along or to find a pace that's comfortable and suitable for you. Breathing in through the nose. Hold. And out. Again, in. Hold. Release. One last time. In. Holding. And out. Continuing to breathe through and allowing the breath to find its own rhythm, its own pace, its own natural flow. Continuing to notice the breath, to allow our awareness, our observation, perhaps even some curiosity, to simply rest on the breath. The breath is so often a reflection of the mind, perhaps even the heart, of the pace and texture of our thoughts and our feelings. And so in noticing the breath, we naturally also notice our thoughts and our feelings. Noticing perhaps the way that the pace or rhythm of our breath is telling us something about how we are feeling in this moment. Noticing, for instance, if our breath is sped up, if our breath feels like it needs to race a little bit. Perhaps we feel out of breath, the way we sometimes do when we're running late. Or when we're feeling overwhelmed. If that's where we're at, no need to change it or force it to change. Just noticing it. Just noticing it allows it to slow down and to settle. Noticing perhaps a heaviness. Perhaps there's a texture of weight, of carrying. Perhaps we're feeling it as a sigh. Just noticing this. Just noticing it so often allows us to lighten the burden a little bit. Just naming the heaviness sometimes creates lightness. Perhaps we're not feeling either of these. Perhaps the breath is telling us something else. Sitting with this friend, this breath, curious to hear from it, whatever it wants to tell us. Or to just sit with it. If we're feeling restless, if the mind feels like it's flickering, we can notice and name it and bring it back. If the mind feels distracted and bored, or perhaps simply preoccupied with something outside of this moment, we can notice and name it, and then bring it back. As we approach these final moments of our meditation together, knowing that soon we will return our awareness to so many other things around us. Perhaps allowing ourselves just a few final moments of intentionally sitting with this breath, perhaps even sitting with some sensation of appreciation or gratitude for this simple companion, this simple friend, this simple and yet wonderful gift of the breath. Sealing perhaps this feeling of gratitude with our final closing deep breath of intention, breathing in and then breathing out, chanting or simply hearing the sacred syllable of the infinite Om. Breathing in deeply. Om. Gently and with care, we can open the eyes, perhaps blinking them open or whatever feels right for us. Gently and with ease, returning our awareness to the room around us and to our virtual gathering. I'd like to continue this week our exploration of taming the mind. We've been talking about how taming the mind, although we sometimes hear teachings, and they're important teachings, that liken taming the mind to an act of um, strongly conquering over. We've been talking about taming the mind in this other sense, this metaphor of parenting the mind, guiding the mind, patiently and kindly, but firmly disciplining and realigning the mind. And so we might ask, how does doing that especially in our meditation practice, how does that show up in the world around us? How might it look? How might it change our own relationship with ourselves and with our minds? And so I'd like to share this reflection that seeks to shine some light on the idea of how transformative this can be. So our reflection today reads, with practice, in other words, with this practice of taming the mind, we can transform our relationship with our minds into a beautiful, healthy, and beneficial friendship. The Gita, in a very beloved quote or verse on the power of the mind, employs this metaphor, this imagery of friendship, and also offers us a kind of a stark warning or something to be vigilant about. And that's an important part of the wisdom teaching as well. So the Gita invites us to reflect on this idea of we have this entity, so to speak. Sometimes we speak of the mind as a part of the self. Sometimes we also speak of the mind as kind of distinct from the self. And both are valid ways of thinking about it. But when we think about the mind, we think about something or even someone, to personify it, that's so close to us, that's the closest to us. And the Gita offers us this invitation to reflect very deeply on, are we cultivating a healthy friendship with this mind that's so close to us? Or are we inadvertently and quite dangerously cultivating and facilitating an enemy? So the verse reads, Bandhur atmatmanastasya yenatmevatmana jitaha anatmanastu shatrutve vartet vartetatmeva shatruvat. For one who has tamed the mind is a friend. But for one who has failed to do so, that very mind behaves with enmity. just like an enemy. So shatruvat means like an enemy. It's interesting. The verse, and not to get too technical, but the verse doesn't. Sometimes it's translated as the mind becomes an enemy, but in a more subtle way, you can also read this as not that the mind becomes an enemy per se, but the mind starts to behave like an enemy. And this reading kind of reminds me of a concept that especially has kind of entered into the lexicon through, I think, kind of millennial speak. I don't remember this term when I was growing up, but there's this term frenemy that some of you may be familiar with. And so shatruvat, I think one way of understanding shatruvat is the mind becomes like a frenemy. One way of understanding, this idea of enemies or frenemies is to think about, an enemy that's somewhere out there, that's clearly marked as an enemy, that's clearly identifies themselves, that tells you straight out, I hate you and I'm going to destroy you. That's, of course, a very dangerous situation. But what's perhaps more dangerous, because it's so insidious, is the enemy that appears to be a friend, that takes the posture of a friend, and that, as this somewhat disturbing image evokes for us, that even while embracing us and smiling, is actually working to, quite literally in this case, stab us in the back, to betray us. There's a certain kind of particularly vile kind of treachery when the person who holds themselves out to be a friend actually behaves like or takes on the characteristics of the enemy, shatruvat. So how might we understand this in terms of the mind? Well, as we've been speaking of, taming the mind really means, and when we speak of the mind in a kind of through the lens of yoga philosophy or Vedantic philosophy, we often really speak about the mind as almost kind of two minds, as that discerning mind and that reactive mind. And so I want to think about the mind behaving like an enemy or a frenemy, as that mind where the manas overpowers the buddhi, where there's not that alignment between the discerning mind and the reactive mind, and when the reactive mind is kind of calling the shots. And so if we analyze it for a moment, what are the characteristics of an enemy or a frenemy? Well, often one of the key characteristics is they undermine us, they sabotage us, right? They work for our destruction. But so often they do this while smiling. So they do this sort of under the surface. So there's this discrepancy between what shows up on the surface, which can seem very friendly, but just beneath the surface, there's this kind of active undermining and sabotaging. And part of the way that they do this is who knows us better than a friend who knows our most intimate weaknesses. And so they zero in on our weaknesses and exploit those weaknesses. Sometimes exploiting those weaknesses by playing on our insecurities, sometimes exploiting those weaknesses by kind of using that which makes us most vulnerable against us, right? And of course, in doing this, very often the enemy or the frenemy is deceptive. They bounce back between these extremes, or they cause us to bounce between these extremes, manipulating us to get their way, right? And some of us, unfortunately, have had this experience with kind of toxic relationships where someone kind of may be very expert at, again, I'm out of my depths here, but keying into some of this millennial speak, at alternatively gassing us up, right? So what does that mean? That means really kind of boosting us up in an unhealthy, artificial, deceptive way. So we maybe feel invincible, or we kind of we let our guards down when we really should be more careful and guarded. So they gas us up, and they also gaslight us, right? So what does that mean? Well, that means they play on those insecurities and fears to convince us that we don't know what we're doing, to play up the fears and the anxieties, and to make us think that in a situation where we might even know better, kind of convince us, no, you're crazy. Follow what I'm saying, right? And so I know it's strange to think about our minds doing that, but if we're honest with ourselves, doesn't this happen all the time? Right? We have the best of intentions, we have the best of aspirations. We may even know what's best for us. And yet that frenemy-like mind, that mind that's unhealthy and not in harmony and is unaligned, um, comes along and convinces us to do that which the mind in the moment wants us to do, right? So to get its way, it says, take this shortcut, behave in this unethical way. Um, you know, even something as simple as fall short of your expectations and your self-discipline, right? You don't need to do this today. You don't need to sit down and practice. You don't need to wake up early even though you said you would. You don't need to do it, keep those commitments. Let's just do what's comfortable and pleasing in the moment instead. But in doing that, the mind gets its way in terms of immediate gratification and ends up sabotaging and undermining us as far as this bigger picture of what we're actually aspiring towards. A good friend, if we look at it, does almost exactly the opposite. Think about the best friend, not just like a hi, hello acquaintanceship, but a best friend who really through thick and thin is there for you. They have your back. What are the characteristics of such a friend? They're always looking out for our best interests. And so often that means looking out for our best interests in terms of the long-term big picture, right? Even if it means helping us to kind of be more disciplined in the short term, but they have our long-term interests at heart. They encourage us to be our highest, best selves, to reach our truest potential, right? They see that in us, even when sometimes we, in our weakness, our insecurity, our anxiety, we may not see it ourselves. We may be willing to give up on ourselves. A good friend is that friend that says, no, you're better than this. You can get there. You can do it, right? They're honest and they're firm with us, but they're also patient and kind. So going back to last week's session, they don't beat us up and make us feel terrible about ourselves, but they also hold us accountable. They hold our feet to the fire, right? They don't let us just get away with our taking the road of our lowest selves. They really push us. Now imagine a mind that has discernment and the reactive mind in alignment, right? That mind starts taking on the characteristics of looking out for our best interests, of helping us to reach our truest potential, of being honest and firm and also patient and kind with ourselves, right? That's the kind of mind that we want to be able to turn to, not just when we're sitting in meditation practice, but also and especially when we're out in the world, right? When in that moment, what decision we're going to make, it's not going to be a matter of, hitting the timeout button and, okay, let me meditate for 20 minutes and then I'll come to my answer. Of course, it's wonderful when we can do that, but so often we hit situations where we're not going to be able to do that. But what is going to help us to tune into either the friend-like mind or the frenemy-like mind, the shatruvat? What's going to make the difference is the practice that we've been cultivating and how that practice has now laid the groundwork for, in the moment, who we're going to turn to, right? And of course, we're being a little playful with this, but are we going to turn to the almost like devil-like, enemy mind that's out there to sort of trip us up and works against our best interests and for kind of selfish short-term gain? Or are we going to feel drawn to turn to that friend-like mind who is looking out for our best interests, right? And so our practice, in one sense, we can understand it as a way of helping ourselves to reorient, to kind of change the relationship, and ultimately to kind of cultivate this friendship relationship rather than this self-sabotaging frenemy relationship. with practice, we can transform our relationship with our minds into a beautiful, healthy, and beneficial friendship. So we'll bring things to a close there. Thank you again for joining us, for being a part of this very precious time we have together to go within and then to reflect on how we'd like that process of going within, that intentional practice, how we'd like it to show up in our lives, in the world around us. As always, we welcome you back. We also welcome your questions and comments. So please feel free to always bring those questions, those comments, those reflections. You can put them in the chat box or simply unmute. But I also want to honor everyone's time. So we'll bring things to a close here. And we invite you back to join us again next week for another session of Shanti in Place. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week ahead of you. Namaste.